The morning sun filtered through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels of Silver Peak Logistics, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished concrete of the warehouse floor. It was a cathedral of industry, a place where multi-million-dollar contracts were fulfilled in a blur of motion. Mark Miller wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of a hand that was calloused and stained with the indelible grime of a 14-hour shift. He could feel the weight of the morning in his bones, a dull ache that never truly went away. His uniform, once a crisp navy blue, was now a map of his labor, faded by constant washing and darkened by streaks of hydraulic fluid. As he adjusted a heavy crate, the sharp, metallic scent that always clung to his skin seemed to bloom in the humid morning air, a scent he had long since stopped noticing but one that defined his very existence. The rhythmic hum of the warehouse suddenly fractured as the heavy double doors of the executive wing swung open. Julian Vane stepped onto the floor like a king surveying a kingdom he found deeply disappointing. His suit was a masterpiece of Italian tailoring, a deep charcoal gray that cost more than Mark earned in 3 months. He moved with a practiced, arrogant stride, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the floor, a sound that signaled everyone to stand a little straighter and look a little busier. Beside him walked Sarah, the operations director, her heels snapping like gunfire. She clutched a designer tablet to her chest, her face set in a permanent expression of professional disdain, her eyes scanning the workers as if she were looking for a reason to be offended. Julian stopped abruptly, his nostrils flaring. He didn't just look at Mark, he recoiled, his upper lip curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silk pocket square, pressing it firmly against his nose. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every forklift stopped moving. Every conversation died. Julian took a slow, deliberate step toward Mark, his eyes raking over the man's tattered sleeves and the slight limp in his posture. He looked at Mark as if he were an oily stain on a white carpet, something that needed to be scrubbed away immediately. "I can smell you from the elevators, Mark," Julian said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far more insulting than a shout. He spoke loudly enough for the entire floor to hear, ensuring the humiliation was public. "It's absolutely unprofessional. We are a premium firm. We represent the elite of this city. And yet, here you are, smelling like a rusted junkyard. Do you have any idea how much money walks through those front doors? High-end clients don't want to breathe the same air as someone who clearly doesn't know what a shower is." Mark felt the heat rise in his neck, a familiar sting of shame that he tried to push down. He stood his ground, his voice low and steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I've been working double shifts to cover the floor, Mr. Vane. Most of the guys are out with the flu, and I didn't want the shipments to fall behind. I haven't had a chance to get home in 36 hours. I'm doing my best to keep your numbers up." Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking over his shoulder at Sarah, who nodded in silent agreement, her eyes cold. "Hard work isn't an excuse for being a public health hazard, Mark. This isn't a coal mine, it's Silver Peak." Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp and brittle. "Julian is right. We have the regional owners visiting tomorrow. If they catch a whiff of whatever that is, it's our heads on the chopping block. We told you weeks ago to handle your personal hygiene. It's a matter of basic respect for your colleagues and this brand." Mark opened his mouth to explain, to tell them about the accident, about the doctors, and about the medicine he couldn't afford because he was paying for his daughter's physical therapy. But Julian simply waved the silk handkerchief dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "I don't want your life story, Mark. I want results. You're a lead here, for God's sake. Set an example. Either go find a bottle of bleach and scrub that stench off your skin, or don't bother coming back after lunch. You're a disgrace to that uniform, and frankly, you're an eyesore to this facility." The manager turned his back before Mark could respond, walking away with Sarah trailing close behind, their laughter echoing faintly over the resumed din of the machinery. Mark stood alone in the center of the aisle, the eyes of his coworkers burning into him. He could feel the metallic scent rising again, thick and heavy, a physical manifestation of a sacrifice no one in this building understood. He looked down at his oil-stained hands, his chest tightening with a mix of fury and despair. He knew he couldn't lose this job, but he also knew that Julian Vane had no idea who he was really talking to, or just how much weight that smelly guy actually carried in this world. Mark took a deep, shuddering breath and headed toward the locker room, the storm finally beginning to break. The cold, clinical hum of the warehouse locker room faded away, replaced by the high-frequency whine of a state-of-the-art research laboratory 15 years in the past. In this memory, the air didn't smell of diesel and dust. It smelled of ozone, sterile plastic, and the electric scent of progress. A younger Mark Miller stood at the center of it all, his lab coat crisp and white, his movements precise as he adjusted the valves on a pressurized containment unit. He was the golden boy of industrial chemistry, the lead developer of AeroPure, a compound designed to neutralize environmental toxins. He had a brilliant career, a beautiful home, and a future that looked as bright as the polished chrome of his equipment. The disaster happened in a heartbeat. A faulty seal on a secondary cooling line hissed, then roared. Thick, amber-colored vapor began to pour into the room, a concentrated, unfinished version of the neutralizer that was never meant for human contact. Mark's 3 junior assistants froze, paralyzed by the sight of the creeping toxic cloud. Without a second thought, Mark dove toward the manual override, shoving his team toward the emergency airlock. He felt the liquid spray hit him before he felt the pain. It was a searing, oily deluge that soaked through his coat and clung to his skin like liquid fire. He managed to crank the valve shut and seal the door just as the chemicals saturated his pores, burning into his very DNA. He had saved their lives, but the cost was etched into his biology forever. The chemical reaction with his sweat glands created a permanent, metallic odor, a biological scar that no doctor could heal and no soap could wash away. The memory shifted, turning dark and heavy. The medical bills for his team's recovery had been astronomical, and Mark, driven by a quiet sense of duty, had exhausted his own savings and insurance to ensure they were cared for after the company's lawyers tried to find loopholes. Then came the diagnosis for his daughter, Lily, a rare spinal condition that required specialized schools and surgeries that cost more than a king's ransom. Mark had traded his prestige for a paycheck, his lab coat for a blue collar, and his pride for the humble dignity of providing for his child. He had become a ghost in the industry he helped build, a man whose heroic sacrifice was now mistaken for poor hygiene by those too shallow to look beneath the surface. The transition back to the present was jarring. Mark stood over a stained metal sink in the warehouse bathroom, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. He was scrubbing his forearms with a stiff bristled brush, the industrial strength soap turning his skin a raw, angry red. He scrubbed until his muscles ached, desperately trying to mask the scent that Julian Vane had called a disgrace. Each stroke of the brush was fueled by the memory of Julian's sneer and Sarah's cold, mocking eyes. They saw a lazy, unwashed laborer, but the man in the mirror was a survivor who had walked through fire to keep others safe. His phone vibrated on the edge of the sink, the screen cracked but glowing with a picture of a smiling little girl in a wheelchair. He picked it up, his breath hitching as he answered. "Hey, princess," he whispered, his voice instantly softening, shedding the hardness of the warehouse floor. On the other end, Lily's voice was bright and full of a hope that Mark felt he was losing. "Hi, Daddy, I just wanted to say thank you. The school said the new medicine is all paid for. Does that mean you have to work tonight too?" Mark closed his eyes tightly, leaning his forehead against the cool, damp tile of the wall. "Yeah, baby, I've got to stay a bit longer. But it's worth it. I'd do anything for you." He hung up the phone and stared at his reflection, the scent of the industrial soap already losing its battle against the metallic tang of his skin. It was the smell of a father's love, the smell of a hero's sacrifice, and the smell of a man pushed to his absolute limit. Across the hall, he could hear the muffled sound of Julian's voice, barking orders and laughing about some high-end lunch reservation. Julian had been born with a silver spoon, a man who had never sacrificed a single thing for anyone else, yet he sat in judgment of those who had given everything. Mark dried his hands on a paper towel, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. The past had broken his body and his bank account, but it hadn't broken his spirit. He walked out of the bathroom and back toward the floor, knowing that the greatest struggle of his life wasn't the chemical burn in his skin, but the boiling injustice of a world that valued a suit more than the man wearing it. Mark walked back onto the warehouse floor, his skin stinging from the chemical burn of the industrial soap, but within minutes, the air around him betrayed him. As his body heat rose with the exertion of moving heavy pallets, the metallic, sharp scent began to seep through his clothes once again, mixing with the faint, citrusy mask of the soap to create something even more noticeable. He saw Julian before he heard him. The manager was standing by the loading dock, checking his reflection in the glass of a fire extinguisher cabinet, adjusting his silk tie with a look of immense self-satisfaction. When Julian turned and caught the scent, his face didn't just register annoyance, it transformed into a mask of pure, theatrical outrage. He didn't walk toward Mark, he stormed, his expensive loafers slapping against the concrete with an echoing rhythm that drew every eye in the building. "You have got to be kidding me," Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched fury that vibrated through the rafters. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about HR or dignity. "I gave you one simple instruction, Mark. 1. Wash your disgusting self or get out. And here you are, stinking up my facility again like a piece of rotting machinery. You are a walking biohazard." Mark stopped, his hands clenching at his sides, his voice low and trembling with the effort of remaining professional. "Mr. Vane, I did exactly what you asked. I scrubbed until I bled. This is a medical condition, sir. I've tried to tell you, I've got the paperwork in my locker if you would just look at it. I've put in 12 hours already today. I'm tired, I'm overworked, and I am just trying to do my job so I can take care of my daughter." Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Oh, the daughter card? Seriously? That is so pathetic. You think I care about your sob story? You're probably just too lazy to buy a stick of deodorant." Sarah stepped out from behind a stack of crates, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes scanning Mark with a cold, clinical disgust. "Julian is right, Mark. This is the third complaint this morning. You're making the other employees uncomfortable. It's a liability. We can't have someone like you representing Silver Peak. It's bad for the brand, and frankly, it's just gross." Julian stepped into Mark's personal space, the scent of his expensive, sandalwood cologne clashing violently with the metallic air. "You're done, Mark. Pick up your trash and get out. You're fired. Effective immediately. For cause. I'm not paying a cent of severance to a man who refuses to follow basic hygiene protocols." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a wad of cash, and peeled off 2 $20 bills, dropping them onto the dirty, oil-stained floor at Mark's feet. "There, that should cover your bus fare. Don't let the door hit you on the way out, though I imagine the smell will linger long after you're gone." Mark looked down at the money on the floor, the ultimate insult to a man who had given his health and his youth to his profession. He looked around the warehouse. His co-workers, men he had trained and protected, looked away. Some stared at their boots. Others suddenly found something very important to do with their clipboards. Only Leo, a young kid Mark had mentored since his first day, took a step forward. "Hey, that's not right, Mr. Vane," Leo said, his voice shaky but brave. "Mark's the best lead we've ever had. He does the work of 3 guys. You can't just throw him out like this." Sarah turned her icy gaze toward Leo, her finger pointing sharply at his chest. "You want to follow him out the door, Leo? Because I can make that happen before you finish your next sentence. Get back to work or you're next." Leo froze, his face turning a deep shade of red, his shoulders slumping as he retreated into the shadows of the racking. He was a silent witness to the injustice, trapped by the same fear that kept everyone else quiet. Mark didn't pick up the money. He stood tall, his eyes locking onto Julian's with an intensity that made the younger man blink. "You think you've won, Julian?" he asked, his voice eerily calm, the kind of calm that precedes a hurricane. "You think because you wear a suit that cost more than a car, you have the right to treat people like garbage? You're so obsessed with how things look that you've forgotten how they actually work. You've made a very big mistake today. One that you won't be able to fix with a silk handkerchief." Julian just sneered, waving a hand toward the exit. Yeah, save the drama for the unemployment line. Oh wait, you won't be getting that either once I file the paperwork for your biological harassment of the staff. Security. Get this man out of my sight. Mark turned and walked toward his locker, his head held high even as the weight of the world felt like it was crushing his chest. He didn't look back as he clutched his battered briefcase and walked out into the pouring rain, leaving behind the only paycheck that kept his daughter fed. He was isolated, humiliated, and broken, or so Julian thought. As Mark sat in his rusting car, watching the rain blur the glass of the skyscraper he had helped keep standing, a new look settled on his face. The time for being the victim was over. The interior of Mark's car felt like a tomb, the air heavy with the scent of damp upholstery and the rhythmic, aggressive drumming of rain against the rusted roof. He sat in the driver's seat, his hands still shaking as he stared at the blurred lights of the warehouse through the windshield. To any passerby, he looked like a broken man, a middle-aged laborer who had just lost his livelihood, his dignity, and his future in one cruel afternoon. A single tear tracked through the grime on his cheek, leaving a clean trail against his skin. He reached for the glove box, his fingers trembling as he fumbled with the latch, pulling out a small, tattered photo of Lily. He looked at her smile and felt a hollow ache in his chest. It looked like the end. It looked like Julian Vane had won. But then, the weeping stopped. Mark's breathing leveled out, becoming slow and deliberate. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his uniform, and the defeated slouch in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a rigid, iron-like posture. He didn't reach for a tissue or a phone to call for help. Instead, he reached for the battered leather briefcase sitting on the passenger seat. He clicked the heavy brass locks open, sounds that resonated like the cocking of a weapon in the quiet cabin. Inside, there were no tools, no lunch containers, and no discarded rags. The briefcase was lined with thick, cream-colored folders embossed with the seal of a prestigious law firm. At the very top lay a document that would have made Julian Vane's blood run cold. It was a right of first refusal and a master land lease agreement. Mark's fingers traced the signature at the bottom, his own. The world saw a warehouse lead with a medical condition, but the reality was far more complex. The land that Silver Peak Logistics sat upon, the very soil Julian walked on with his $3,000 shoes, didn't belong to the corporation. It belonged to the Miller family estate, a private trust that Mark had managed in silence for over a decade. He had taken the job at the warehouse not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he wanted to oversee the legacy of the company he had helped build from the ground up during his years in the lab. He wanted to stay close to the people, to understand the heartbeat of the floor, and to ensure his daughter's future was secured by more than just a trust fund. He pulled out his phone, but he didn't call an unemployment office. He dialed a private number that few people in the state possessed. The call was answered on the first ring. "Mark," a voice said on the other end, formal and deeply respectful. "We've been waiting for your word. Is it time?" Mark looked back at the towering glass building, his eyes narrowed and cold. "The lease for Silver Peak is up for renewal in 48 hours, isn't it, Arthur?" he asked, his voice no longer timid or tired, but commanding and resonant. There was a pause on the line. "Yes, sir. They are expecting to sign the 20-year extension at the grand opening gala on Thursday." Mark felt a grim smile pull at the corners of his mouth. Julian had fired him for a scent he couldn't control, citing a breach of image. In doing so, Julian had unwittingly triggered a key personnel clause in the land lease, a clause that required the estate's approval for any major staffing changes at the management level. By firing Mark without cause and fabricating a record of biological harassment, Julian hadn't just been a bully, he had legally breached the very contract that allowed the building to exist. "I want the full audit triggered," Mark said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "And I want the regional owner to know that the trustee will be attending the gala in person. Don't mention my name. Just tell them the landlord is coming to collect." He hung up and leaned his head back against the seat, watching a security guard, likely acting on Julian's orders, patrol the perimeter of the lot to make sure he hadn't lingered. Mark didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like a hunter. He had been played the fool for months, enduring the sneers and the Karen antics of Sarah, but the game had shifted. Julian and Sarah were currently upstairs, likely popping a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate, cleaning up the trash, completely unaware that they had just handed the trash the keys to their kingdom. Mark shifted the car into gear, the engine groaning as he pulled out of the lot. He wasn't going home to hide. He was going to a tailor he hadn't visited in years, and then to a private medical facility that specialized in the high-end chemical treatments he usually bypassed to save money for Lily. He was going to spend the next 48 hours preparing a trap so absolute that Julian Vane wouldn't even see the walls closing in until it was too late. The time for humility was over, the time for the long game had begun. While the rain continued to lash against the warehouse skylights, the atmosphere inside the executive suite was one of triumphant decadence. Julian Vane leaned back in his leather swivel chair, his feet resting on a mahogany desk that cost more than most men made in a year. He swirled a glass of 20-year-old scotch, the amber liquid catching the light as he shared a smug grin with Sarah. She was busy at her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys with a predatory efficiency as she finalized the termination paperwork. "Can you believe the nerve of that guy?" Julian asked, his voice thick with a self-satisfied drawl. "Trying to tell me it was a medical condition. As if I'm some idiot who's never heard of a shower. I swear, Sarah, some people have no respect for the image we're trying to build here." Sarah didn't even look up, her eyes fixed on the screen as she clicked submit on the internal HR portal. "Well, he's gone now, Julian. And I've flagged him as a safety risk in the system. No other logistics firm in the tri-state area will touch him once they see the notes on his hygiene and insubordination. Consider the trash officially taken out." She let out a dry, sharp laugh and reached for her own glass. "Tomorrow's gala is going to be flawless. With that eyesore out of the warehouse, the board will finally see that you're ready for the vice president spot." The office echoed with their shared laughter, a hollow sound of two people who believed they had successfully crushed a man's life beneath their heels without a single consequence. But across town, in a world they couldn't imagine, Mark Miller was undergoing a transformation that was as meticulous as it was expensive. He sat in a sleek, white-walled medical clinic, the air around him filled with the hum of high-end air purifiers. A specialist in industrial toxicology worked quietly, applying a specialized, non-invasive enzyme blocker to Mark's skin, a temporary but powerful treatment that would neutralize his metallic scent for exactly 12 hours. It was a luxury Mark had always denied himself, choosing instead to put every spare cent into Lily's school fund, but today, it was a necessary investment in justice. He watched the technician work, his eyes hard and focused. There was no sadness left in him, only a quiet, burning resolve. The preparation didn't stop at the clinic. Mark spent the following hours in a quiet, wood-paneled office downtown, surrounded by a team of lawyers who spoke in low, deferential tones. They laid out the trap with surgical precision. Phone calls were made to the parent company's largest creditors. Secret meetings were held with members of the board who had long been tired of Sarah's, Karen, style of management and Julian's blatant nepotism. Mark reviewed the documents one last time, his signature bold and unwavering on the notices of lease termination and the lawsuits for defamation and wrongful termination. He was no longer the man who scrubbed until he bled. He was the man who was about to pull the rug out from under an entire empire. As the sun began to set on the day before the gala, Mark stood in a high-end tailor's shop, staring at his reflection. He was draped in a bespoke charcoal suit made of Italian wool, the fabric shifting like liquid as he moved. The tailor adjusted the cuffs, nodding in approval at the man who stood before him, a man who radiated power, discipline, and an undeniable sense of command. Mark looked at his hands, the grease was gone, the dirt was washed away, and for the first time in 15 years, he didn't smell like a laboratory accident. He looked like exactly what he was, the landlord of the very ground Julian Vane claimed to rule. Back at the warehouse, Julian was busy rehearsing his speech in front of a mirror, practicing the way he would dismiss any questions about the sudden departure of the warehouse lead. He felt invincible. He felt like he had played the game perfectly. He had no idea that while he was practicing his smirk, Mark Miller was sitting in a quiet living room, holding his daughter's hand and promising her that by this time tomorrow, everything was going to change. Mark wasn't just setting a trap, he was preparing to deliver a lesson that Julian Vane would never forget. The silence of his preparation was the silence before a landslide, and when it finally broke, it would bury Julian and Sarah under the weight of their own arrogance. The transformation of the Silver Peak logistics warehouse was nothing short of a theatrical illusion. Where 48 hours ago there had been the grime of industrial labor and the roar of forklifts, there was now the soft, ambient glow of crystal chandeliers and the gentle clinking of champagne flutes. The scent of diesel and cardboard had been scrubbed away, replaced by an overwhelming cloud of expensive floral arrangements and the heavy, musky perfumes of the city's elite. Julian Vane moved through the crowd like a man who had already won the lottery. He adjusted his cufflinks every few minutes, making sure the light hit the diamonds just right, and flashed a predatory, white-toothed smile at every board member he encountered. Beside him, Sarah was a vision of sharp, brittle elegance in a silk gown that shimmered like oil on water. She tapped her manicured nails against her glass, her eyes darting around the room, hunting for anyone important enough to impress. "It really is amazing what a little cleaning can do," Julian remarked, leaning toward a group of potential investors. He gestured vaguely toward the floor where Mark had been humiliated just 2 days prior. "We had to clear out some of the lingering debris. Some people just don't fit the vision of a high-growth, premium logistics firm. You know how it is. You have to prune the garden to let the flowers bloom." Sarah let out a sharp, practiced titter of laughter, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Oh, Julian is being modest. He personally oversaw the removal of a particularly stubborn biological hazard. It's all about maintaining standards. If you let one person slide, the whole brand rots from the inside out." The double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. A man stepped in, and the sheer gravity of his presence caused the chatter to die down in waves. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him with the precision of armor, his hair swept back, his posture radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. Mark Miller didn't look like a warehouse lead, he looked like the man who decided which empires lived and which died. He moved through the crowd with a slow, deliberate stride, and for a moment, the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns parted for him. Julian blinked, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He didn't recognize the man, not yet. The lighting was different, the clothes were world-class, and the specialized enzyme treatment had completely neutralized the scent that Julian had used as a weapon. Julian saw only a high-level VIP, a whale he needed to harpoon to secure his promotion. He nudged Sarah and smoothed his jacket, stepping forward to intercept the newcomer with a hand extended and a fake, oily warmth in his eyes. "Good evening, sir," Julian chirped, his voice shifting into its most subservient, networking tone. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure. I'm Julian Vane, the floor manager and the architect of this entire expansion. Welcome to Silver Peak. I hope the atmosphere is to your liking. We've gone to great lengths to ensure everything here is pristine." He paused, leaning in slightly as if sharing a secret. "We recently had to let go of some of the lower-tier staff who didn't quite understand the concept of luxury. It's so hard to find good help that doesn't carry the stench of the streets with them, isn't it?" Mark stopped. He didn't take Julian's hand. He stood perfectly still, looking down at Julian with a gaze that was as cold and unforgiving as a winter morning. He let the silence stretch, let it become heavy and uncomfortable, until Julian's hand began to tremble slightly and he slowly pulled it back, a bead of sweat forming at his hairline. Mark leaned in just an inch, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in Julian's chest. "Is that what you told yourself, Julian? That you were just taking out the trash?" Julian's brow furrowed, a flicker of terrifying recognition dancing behind his eyes, though his brain refused to accept what his heart already knew. I'm sorry? Do I know you?" Sarah stepped up, her eyes narrowing as she scanned Mark's face, her Karen instincts flaring up as she prepared to be offended on Julian's behalf. "Excuse me, but do you have an invitation? This is a private event for the board and our most distinguished partners. If you're just here to cause trouble, I'll have security escort you out faster than the last person who didn't belong here." Mark didn't blink. He didn't look at Sarah. He kept his eyes locked on Julian, watching as the younger man's face began to pale, the realization slowly bubbling to the surface like poison. I think you'll find, Sarah, that I don't need an invitation to stand on my own property, Mark said, his voice rising just enough to catch the attention of the nearby board members. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Mark's face, then at the suit, then at the way the chairman of the board was suddenly rushing toward them with a look of frantic, wide-eyed respect. The atmosphere in the room shifted from celebratory to electric. The trap was fully set, the prey was cornered, and the man Julian had treated like garbage was about to show the entire city exactly who was in charge. The silence that swept through the warehouse-turned-ballroom was heavy and sudden, a physical weight that made the air feel thin. Julian Vane stood frozen, his hand still half extended in a greeting that had died on his lips. He stared at the man in the charcoal gray suit, his eyes darting frantically over Mark's face, searching for the dirty, broken warehouse lead he had humiliated 48 hours ago. But the man standing before him was a titan. The color drained from Julian's face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to reach out to a nearby cocktail table to steady himself, his fingers rattling against the crystal glasses. Sarah's face, usually a mask of rehearsed perfection, contorted into a grimace of pure, panicked denial. She stepped forward, her high heels clicking aggressively on the floor as she pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Mark's chest. "This is a joke," she shrieked, her voice cracking and reaching a pitch that made the board members wince. "This is a pathetic prank. I know who you are. You're that disgusting laborer we threw out like the garbage you are. You're the smelly guy from the floor. Security. Why is he still standing here? Get this imposter out of my sight before he contaminates the entire room." The chairman of the board, a silver-haired man with a face like granite, stepped into the light, his expression one of absolute, terrifying disappointment. He didn't look at Sarah, he looked directly at Mark and bowed his head slightly. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice amplified by the silent room, "we are honored by your presence. I apologize for this unfortunate interruption." Mark didn't look at the chairman. He kept his eyes fixed on Julian, who was now sweating so profusely that his silk tie was beginning to darken. Mark reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek digital recorder. He pressed a button, and Julian's own voice, loud, arrogant, and cruel, began to play through the ballroom's high-end sound system. "I told you to fix it. You're a disgrace to the company uniform. I'm filing the paperwork for biological harassment, so you don't get a cent of severance. Go live in a landfill where you belong." The recording cut to Sarah's voice, cold and mocking. "Consider the trash officially taken out. No other firm will touch him once they see my notes." As the audio faded, a collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. The board members looked at Julian and Sarah with a disgust that surpassed anything Julian had ever felt for Mark. Mark stepped closer to Julian, his shadow towering over the younger man. "You were so obsessed with the surface, Julian, that you forgot to check the foundation. You called me a biohazard because of a scent I carried while saving lives in the very lab that built this company's fortune. You fired me for a sacrifice you aren't brave enough to make." Mark turned to the chairman, his voice ringing out with a new, commanding power. "This building sits on my family's land. The lease you were hoping to sign tonight contains a clause that protects the dignity of every worker on this floor. A clause that Julian and Sarah have flagrantly violated. Therefore, as the trustee of the Miller estate, I am officially declaring Silver Peak Logistics in material breach of contract. I am terminating your lease, effective immediately." The room exploded into a frantic murmur. Julian fell to his knees, his face wet with tears as he reached out to grab the hem of Mark's trousers. "Please, Mr. Miller, sir, I didn't know. I was just trying to protect the image. I can change, I swear. I'll give you your job back. You can be the manager. Just don't do this. I'll lose everything." Mark looked down at him, his expression devoid of pity. "You don't get it, Julian. I don't want my job back. I already have a job. I'm the landlord. And as of this moment, you're the one who's trespassing. Mark looked up at the security guards, who were now standing behind Julian and Sarah. These two have been trespassing on common decency for long enough. Escort them out, and ensure they are served with the defamation and fraud lawsuits on their way to the sidewalk. Sarah tried to scream, to maintain her Karen facade one last time, but her voice failed her as the guards gripped her arms. She and Julian were dragged through the center of the ballroom, past the very people they had tried so hard to impress, their reputations shattered beyond repair. As the heavy double doors closed behind them for the final time, Mark stood at the center of the room, the silence finally turning into a slow, thunderous round of applause. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered with the weight of the very ground they stood on. The dust from the gala had long since settled, but the echoes of that night had rewritten the lives of everyone at Silver Peak. Within weeks, the once feared corporate giant underwent a radical transformation. Mark Miller, no longer the invisible laborer in the oil-stained uniform, stepped into the role of executive chairman, but he didn't do it from a mahogany desk on the top floor. He spent his first day back on the warehouse floor, shaking the hands of every worker who had kept their heads down in fear during the old regime. He converted the company into a worker-owned cooperative, ensuring that those who did the heavy lifting actually shared in the profits. One of his first official acts was the construction of the Miller Wellness Center, a world-class on-site medical facility dedicated to employees with chronic conditions and disabilities, ensuring that no one would ever have to choose between their health and their dignity again. Leo, the young man who had dared to speak up when Julian launched his final attack, found himself sitting in a new office. Mark had appointed him as the chief of operations, not because of a fancy degree, but because of a quality Julian Vane never understood: character. Leo looked out over the floor, his eyes bright with a sense of purpose he hadn't known was possible in a warehouse. As for Julian and Sarah, the fall was as steep as their arrogance had been high. Blacklisted from every logistics and retail firm in the country, their names became synonymous with corporate toxicity. Sarah's luxury lifestyle evaporated under the weight of legal fees, forcing her into an early, bitter retirement in a small apartment far from the glass towers she once worshipped. Julian fared even worse. After his legal battles drained his family's trust, he was last seen in a reflective orange vest, picking up litter along the very highway Mark used to drive to work. 5 years later, the world looked very different through the window of a sleek, electric sedan. Mark sat in the driver's seat, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel, his charcoal suit fitting as comfortably as a second skin. He pulled into the driveway of a beautiful, sun-drenched home where the air smelled of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. The door flew open, and a teenage girl came running out, not in a wheelchair, but on her own 2 feet. Lily's recovery had been the greatest victory of Mark's life, a miracle funded by the very company that had once tried to discard him. He caught her in a hug, the warmth of the sun on their backs, a moment of pure, earned peace that no amount of money could truly buy. As they walked inside, Mark happened to glance at a small, framed photo on the hallway table. It was a picture of him from years ago, tired and covered in grime, standing in the middle of the warehouse. He didn't look at it with shame, but with a quiet, profound respect. He remembered the metallic scent, the aching joints, and the cold sneers of people who thought they were better than him. He realized then that the smell Julian had hated so much wasn't the scent of failure. It was the scent of a man who was willing to lose everything to do what was right. It was the scent of resilience. The world often tells us that we are defined by how we look, what we wear, or the title on our business card. We are taught to look down at the dirt on a worker's boots and assume we know their story. But the truth is far deeper. True worth isn't found in the fragrance of expensive cologne or the crispness of a designer suit. It is found in the integrity of a person's heart and the strength they show when no one is watching. You should never judge a book by its cover, because the person you're looking down on might just be the one who owns the ground you're standing on. Kindness costs nothing, but arrogance can cost you everything. In the end, we all leave a scent behind. Make sure yours is the scent of a life well lived and a heart that remained kind, even when the world was cold.